Imagine being born into a family that has ruled unbroken for 600 years. Imagine your father commands an empire that once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the mountains of the Balkans to the shores of North Africa. Imagine your family's name alone, spoken anywhere in Istanbul, makes soldiers straighten their backs, makes ministers lower their eyes, makes entire cities organize their calendars around the movements of your household. Now imagine you are 10 years old, and none of that means anything anymore. You do not yet understand treaties. You do not understand what occupation means, or why foreign warships now sit anchored outside your father's palace windows. You do not understand why the men who once bowed to your family now argue in parliaments about whether your family should be allowed to exist at all. All you know is that one night, in the dark, your father wakes you and tells you to dress quickly. No formal goodbyes, no warning to the rest of the household, no procession, no guard of honor, none of the ceremony a prince is supposed to receive. Just you and him and a handful of men slipping out through a side door that royal children are never supposed to use. By morning, the empire that had outlived kings, sultans, wars, and centuries would no longer legally exist. And the boy who, under any other circumstances, would have grown up to inherit a 600-year throne would instead spend the rest of his life as nobody in particular. A name without a title that meant anything. A prince without a country. A child forced to become an adult in the back of a car in the middle of the night, with no idea that he was living through the final hours of an empire. His name was Şehzade Mehmed Ertuğrul. If you have never heard of him, you are not alone. History barely remembers him. He does not appear in most textbooks. There are no statues of him, no palaces named after him, no wars fought in his name. But his story, quiet, devastating, and almost completely untold, is, in many ways, more haunting than the stories of the sultans who came before him. Because his story isn't about power. It's about what happens to a child the moment the world decides that his entire family no longer gets to exist. This is what happened to him. And by the end, you may find yourself thinking about him longer than you expect to. To understand exactly what Ertuğrul lost, you first have to understand what he was born into. Because what he lost wasn't just a title. It was one of the longest unbroken ruling dynasties in human history. On November 5, 1912, in a quiet mansion overlooking the Bosphorus in Çengelköy, a boy was born to Sultan Mehmed Vahidettin, a man who would later become known to history as Mehmed VI, and his consort, Müveddet Kadın. He was the only son his father would ever have. 3 daughters had come before him. He was the last child born into that branch of the family, and from the moment he arrived, every eye in the household understood exactly what that meant. He was the heir, the one name that mattered more than any other in the next generation. At the moment of his birth, the House of Osman had already ruled continuously for more than 6 centuries, 36 sultans, stretching back to the 13th century, an empire that had, at its height, commanded the largest and most feared navy in the Mediterranean, an empire that had laid siege to Vienna twice, and came close enough to changing the shape of European history that historians still debate what might have happened if either siege had succeeded. An empire that governed millions of subjects of different faiths, languages, and cultures across 3 continents, held together not by brute force alone, but by one of the most sophisticated administrative systems in the pre-modern world. Viziers, pashas, provincial governors, religious courts, and a bureaucracy more advanced than most of its European rivals. This was the inheritance waiting for a boy who, at that point, could not even walk yet. But here is the part almost no one explains properly. By the time Ertuğrul was old enough to understand his own name, the empire he was born to inherit was already dying. Not slowly, the way empires sometimes fade over centuries. Quickly, violently, within the span of a single childhood. His father did not inherit an empire at its height. Mehmed VI inherited the wreckage of one. The First World War had ended in catastrophe for the Ottomans. They had gambled on the losing side, allied with Germany and the Central Powers, and when the war ended in 1918, the price of that gamble came due in full. By the time Mehmed VI became Sultan that same year, Istanbul, the imperial capital, the seat of 600 years of Ottoman power, was already under Allied military occupation. British, French, and Italian warships sat anchored in the Bosphorus, close enough that a boy playing in a palace garden could look up and see foreign flags flying over his own capital city. Ertuğrul was raised behind palace walls in the middle of this collapse, tutored privately by a court literature instructor named Kaymakam Emin Bey, a man who taught in the imperial schools and was specifically assigned to prepare young princes for the responsibilities awaiting them. Ertuğrul learned the manners expected of a Şehzade, the etiquette, the ceremonial language, the bearing that separated an Ottoman prince from every other child in the empire. He was, in every sense, being groomed for a role. The tragedy is that the world that role belonged to was disappearing faster than anyone in that palace nursery wanted to admit. While tutors taught a small boy poetry and protocol inside marble hallways, 300 kilometers away in Ankara, a war hero named Mustafa Kemal was quietly assembling a movement that would decide, within a few short years, whether the Ottoman dynasty had any future at all. Nobody told Ertuğrul that. Nobody could have. He was still learning to read. Think about the sheer scale of what a Şehzade of his generation would have been raised to believe was his birthright. The Ottoman court once operated one of the most elaborate systems of royal life on earth. A world of harem quarters, private tutors for every subject from calligraphy to horsemanship, ceremonial processions through the streets of Istanbul, and an understanding, absorbed almost from infancy, that his family's authority did not need to explain itself. Sultans before him had commissioned some of the greatest architecture in the Islamic world. They had corresponded, as equals, with the kings and emperors of Europe. For over 600 years, the question of whether an Ottoman prince mattered had never needed to be asked. Ertuğrul was the first generation in that entire 600-year line for whom the answer to that question would turn out to be no. Here is what nobody in that palace nursery could have explained to a 10-year-old boy. His family's power had already been dying for years before he was even born, and the men who finally ended it were not simply foreign invaders. In the most painful irony of all, the final blow came from his own people. After the devastation of the First World War, the victorious Allied powers imposed the Treaty of Sèvres on the Ottoman government in 1920. A settlement so punishing that it would have effectively dismembered the empire, carving away vast stretches of Anatolian territory and handing them to Greece, to an independent Armenia, and to zones of direct foreign influence. Mehmed VI's government, occupied and militarily powerless, with foreign troops controlling much of the capital, had almost no leverage to resist. The Sultan's ministers signed it. And across the empire, ordinary Turks watched their homeland being carved up on paper by foreign diplomats who had never set foot in most of the territory they were dividing. That single decision, a treaty signed under occupation, and a capital controlled by foreign warships, would define everything that happened next. Because something Mehmed VI's government did not anticipate was resistance from within its own ranks. Mustafa Kemal, a decorated war hero from the Gallipoli campaign, refused to accept the terms of Sèvres. He refused to accept that a government operating under foreign occupation had the moral authority to sign away Turkish land. He left Istanbul, traveled into the Anatolian interior, and began organizing a nationalist resistance movement from a base of operations in Ankara, deliberately, symbolically, outside the reach of the Sultan's palace and the Allied warships that dominated the capital. What followed was not simply a political disagreement. It became a full-scale war for the future of the nation. The Turkish War of Independence, fought between Kemal's nationalist forces and a shifting set of occupying powers, most significantly Greek forces advancing deep into Anatolia with British and Allied backing. For 4 years that war raged, through 1919, 1920, 1921, and into 1922. Cities changed hands, villages burned, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians died. And for 4 of the most formative years of his childhood, Ertuğrul grew up inside a palace that was, in every meaningful sense, sitting on top of a slowly detonating bomb. He grew from a small child barely old enough to understand ceremony into a boy old enough to sense, even if no one explained it to him directly, that something enormous and irreversible was breaking apart around him. By the end of the summer of 1922, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Kemal's nationalist forces had decisively defeated the Greek army in Anatolia and were advancing toward the coast. The nationalist movement now held real, undeniable military and political power, and it had absolutely no intention of sharing that power with a sultan whose government had cooperated with the very foreign occupiers the nationalists had just spent 4 years fighting to expel. On November 1st, 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara did something that had not happened in over 600 years of continuous Ottoman rule. They voted to abolish the Sultanate entirely. With a single legislative act, not a battle, not a siege, not a single shot fired at the palace, the position Ertuğrul's father held, a position tracing an unbroken line of succession back to the 13th century founder of the dynasty, was declared to no longer exist. The office itself was erased from the constitution of the new Turkey that was being built in Ankara. Mehmed VI was still, at that exact moment, technically alive. Still technically sitting inside his own palace in Istanbul. But the empire he supposedly ruled had, on paper, just voted him out of existence while he was still living inside it. He had 16 days left in the only home his son had ever known. And with almost no time left to decide anything, he made a choice that would define the rest of that son's entire life. Consider, too, the strange in-between world Ertuğrul was living in during those final 16 days. The palace staff still bowed. The ceremonial protocols still, technically, continued. And yet outside the palace walls, newspapers were already debating what should happen to the former dynasty, as if the family that had ruled the country for 6 centuries had already, in the public imagination, become a historical footnote rather than a living household with a 10-year-old boy still inside it. Ertuğrul was, in effect, living inside a building that the rest of the country had already begun writing about in the past tense. On the morning of November 17th, 1922, Sultan Mehmed VI made the decision that would shape everything that came after for his 10-year-old son. He did not summon his court. He did not organize a formal, dignified departure befitting 6 centuries of Ottoman ceremony. He moved in secrecy, fully aware that the new nationalist government in Ankara might not guarantee his personal safety, and fully aware that his own reputation among ordinary Turkish citizens had been badly damaged. To many, he was not a tragic, deposed monarch. He was the Sultan who had cooperated with foreign occupiers during the darkest years of the war. There would be no sympathetic crowds waiting to see him off. If anything, there was real danger in staying even 1 day longer than necessary. So he took Ertuğrul, and almost no one else, not his other children, not the wider palace household that had served the family for generations, just his 10-year-old son, and a small handful of trusted palace officials who moved with them into the dark. Picture what that actually looked like from the boy's perspective. A child who had spent literally his entire life inside palace walls, surrounded from birth by servants, tutors, ceremony, silk, marble, and the quiet, absolute certainty that he was someone important, was, within the space of a single night, moved through back corridors he had probably never used before, handed into the custody of British officials arranging his father's evacuation, and taken aboard a warship waiting out in the Bosphorus. Not escorted as a prince, moved as a refugee. By the time the sun rose over Istanbul the next morning, Sultan Mehmed VI, the 36th and, as it would turn out, absolutely final Ottoman Sultan, had left Turkey forever. He would never set foot on Turkish soil again for the rest of his life. Neither would his son. Neither, in fact, would almost any member of that dynasty for years to come. The new Turkish government would soon pass laws formally exiling the entire Ottoman royal family from the country their ancestors had ruled for 600 years. Father and son eventually settled in San Remo on the Italian Riviera, not in a palace befitting an emperor, but in a modest rented villa, a strange and diminished exile for a family that had once commanded entire palace complexes across 3 continents. The rest of the household, including Ertuğrul's own mother, did not join them right away. They remained separated for nearly 2 full years, only reuniting in San Remo in 1924. And when Muvaddet Kadın finally did arrive, she and her son were given a single floor of the villa to share between them. 1 floor. For a family that had once owned entire wings of Topkapi Palace and Dolmabahce Palace, entire buildings staffed by hundreds of servants, but even that fragile, diminished stability didn't last. In May of 1926, Mehmed VI died in San Remo, still, until his very final breath, refusing to accept that his deposition had ever been legitimate, still referring to himself privately as Sultan. Ertuğrul was 14 years old, and in that single moment, the last adult who had shared every step of his exile, the one person alive who understood firsthand exactly what had been lost, was gone. What Ertuğrul did in the aftermath of his father's death reveals more about who he actually was than almost anything else recorded about his short life. He left his mother. He chose instead to go live with his older half-sister, Sabiha Sultan, choosing the sibling who had also lost everything, who understood the exile from the inside, over the parent who was, in every biological sense, still present in his life. And then came a wound that, by every surviving account, never healed. His mother, now a widow with no remaining status or title of any consequence, eventually remarried, this time to a Turkish civilian living in Egypt. Later, taking advantage of a law that eventually permitted the widows of former sultans to return to Turkish soil, she moved back to Istanbul and settled into the very same mansion in Çengelköy, where Ertuğrul himself had been born 14 years earlier. Ertuğrul never accepted that remarriage. He never forgave it. And according to every historical account that survives, most drawn from Murat Bardakçı's extensive research into the exiled Ottoman family, he never saw his mother again for the rest of his life. Sit with that for a moment. A boy who had already lost his empire, his home, his country, and his father by the age of 14, and who then, by his own deliberate choice, lost his mother too. Not to death, to a wound he refused to allow to close for reasons that died with him. From there, he was sent to a boarding school in Grasse, a small provincial town in the south of France best known for its perfume industry, about as far, in every sense, from the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace as a place could possibly feel. There, a teenage prince with no empire left to inherit, no meaningful fortune, and no family beside him studied quietly among classmates who almost certainly had no real understanding of who he actually was, or what his name had once meant. The empire was gone, the palace was gone, and now, one by one, his family was gone too. All that remained was a young man carrying a name that used to mean absolutely everything. And now, in the eyes of the wider world, meant almost nothing at all. It is worth pausing here to picture the daily texture of that exile, rather than just its milestones. There was no fortune waiting for him the way there might have been for exiled royalty from wealthier, more cooperative dynasties elsewhere in Europe. The new Turkish state had seized Ottoman properties and assets inside the country. What money the family had access to abroad was limited, carefully managed, and nowhere near enough to sustain the kind of life a Şehzade would once have taken for granted. Sabiha Sultan's household, where Ertuğrul spent his adolescence, was itself a household in reduced circumstances, dignified, but far from the palace life either of them had been born into. For a boy raised to believe that servants, silk, and ceremony were simply the natural order of things. Learning to live modestly, in borrowed rooms, in someone else's country, must have been its own quiet, ongoing grief. One with no single dramatic moment, just 1,000 small daily reminders of everything that no longer existed. Ertuğrul's story does not end with a dramatic final act, a battle, or a public reckoning. And in some ways, that absence of drama is the most tragic detail of all. On July 2, 1944, in Cairo, Egypt, a city that had become a kind of unofficial refuge for exiled Ottoman royals, Şehzade Mehmed Ertuğrul, the boy who had once been the presumed future of a 600-year dynasty, collapsed during a tennis match. Within a matter of hours, he was dead. He was 31 years old. No war took him, no assassin, no palace intrigue, no dramatic conspiracy. Just an unidentified illness that ended his life quietly, thousands of miles from the palace where he was born, in a country that had never truly been his own. He was buried in the mausoleum of Abbas Hilmi Pasha in Cairo, not among 6 centuries of his own ancestors back in Istanbul, because at the time of his death, the exiled Ottoman family was still formally forbidden by Turkish law from returning to the land their dynasty had once ruled. His mother, the woman he had refused to see for nearly 2 decades, was, by every surviving account, devastated by his death. She reportedly never recovered from it. The estrangement that had once felt, to her son at least, like a wound with a reason behind it became, the moment he died, a wound with no possibility of repair. There was no reunion left to have, no conversation left to finish, no apology left to offer in either direction. Just a grief that outlived him by years. Consider the full arc of that one life. Born into an empire that had ruled 3 continents for 600 years. Exiled at 10 years old with nothing but his father and the clothes he was wearing that night. Orphaned at 14. Estranged by his own choice, from his own mother. Educated quietly, almost anonymously, in a foreign country that had no idea what his name once meant. And dead at 31, buried far from the palace where he was born, in a mausoleum that did not even belong to his own family. He was, by direct blood, the last son of the last Ottoman Sultan. And today, outside of a small circle of dedicated historians, almost nobody knows his name. That, in the end, is exactly what makes his story worth telling. Not because he built something, conquered something, or left behind a legacy of power the way his ancestors did, but because his life shows us something that history rarely lets us witness up close, what it actually feels like to be a child standing at the precise moment an empire ends, and to spend the rest of a short, quiet, largely invisible life living inside that empire's shadow. 600 years of Ottoman rule did not end with a final great battle or a single dramatic scene fit for the history books. It ended with a 10-year-old boy being quietly moved through a side door in the middle of the night. And that single night echoed through every remaining year of his life, in every room, every relationship, and every country he was never fully welcomed back into. If this story moved you, understand that Ertuğrul is only one thread in a much larger, largely forgotten tapestry. There were sons, daughters, wives, and heirs of a dozen fallen dynasties across the 20th century, whose names history simply let slip through the cracks. Subscribe, because their stories deserve to be told too, and there are many more of them still waiting.